Okay, let's begin. We're already late by about 4 minutes. Good evening. Welcome, thank you for coming. Tonight we're going to do some review, really. We're going to talk about the charrettes. We're going to talk about what came out of the charrettes. We want to get a consensus as to whether or not we're going in the right direction. We want to make sure that everyone who participated got the opportunity to say what they wanted to say, to hear what they needed to hear, and to make sure that we are in basic agreement. We don't have to be 100% in agreement, but we want to be somewhere that the concepts are correct and the direction we're going in is the appropriate direction. We're also going to talk about the effort that was made to try and get people to come out to the charrettes. I was fairly pleased. I thought that we had a pretty good reception. The first morning we had about 40 people out. I thought that was decent. But having not experienced it before, what did I know? And I was told that they, well, particularly from Dan, who was Mr. Doom and Gloom to begin with, but he didn't think that there were enough people there. Do you find that?
I'm not going to comment on that.
You don't have to. Your action said it. But Dan would have liked it, and I would have liked it, and I think we all would have liked it. Had a couple hundred people there, but the fact of the matter is we did have good representation, and as I walked around table to table, I was very pleased because I thought we had great input. It was very interesting to hear what you guys had to say, but it was also very interesting to hear what the public had to say. And I heard a lot of good comments, and I heard a lot of good discussion. We would bring up a particular item or a thought process, and someone from the public would say, hey, maybe not so many words, but they would say, well, wait a second, we're not exactly sure we want to go in that direction, and they had an alternative point of view, which was great to hear. So I thought it was very productive, and if you had an opportunity to attend, then not only on Saturday, but Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and even the final on Thursday, okay, it was pretty interesting because we did get some other people out as they came out at some of the breakout sessions. The lunch and learns were very good, at least I found them to be very good, and we got some good attendance at those too. So I don't know if Dan has found Lee or not yet. You're still looking for him? Okay, so we'll wait for him to do that, but in the meantime, let's get an outreach activity update from Annette Herman and Kim Shore.
Hello everyone. I have just kind of a general recap of the outreach that we've tried to do thus far. This has included email blasts, which started in June actually, to various community members and stakeholders and people who had given us their emails who are interested. We've done some website announcements, save the date flyers where they were little like 4x6 sheets with double-sided with the charrette schedule on them, and we posted them on people's windshields during various events in the village and throughout the town. We did a major mailing of a letter to let people know within 600 feet of the centers that we were looking at during the charrette. So we actually mailed out almost 2,000 letters to those people near those centers. And then we hung up posters and the schedules of the charrette in businesses in those centers as well, and tried to give them a heads up of what was going on by giving them the posters, and hopefully they hung them up or showed their clientele when they came in. And the last thing we kind of did was we even went as far as, thanks to Annette, getting to be on the radio and on a few shows on TV, Western New York Living and AM Buffalo, and a radio show on 102.9 FM. And we kind of just talked about the charrette and tried to get people out for the Saturday event was our main goal for those. So that's kind of just a general recap of the various things that the town has done.
I do want to commend Kim and also Gary, for being on the two programs because they did a really good job representing the project. It's kind of a complicated and heady topic for people that aren't used to thinking about coding, and I think the fact that we got 40 people out on a Saturday morning was pretty remarkable. I know that we were hoping for hundreds, and maybe with a huge budget and a year's leading up to it, maybe we would have been able to generate an even bigger turnout. But I think that 40 people on a Saturday beautiful fall morning was probably pretty remarkable. I will say that once they were on the television, our demographics changed. Prior to their appearance, we were averaging a audience of viewers of women 65 plus, and we could tell that from our Facebook audience. And once they were on television, that switched, our top audience switched to women 25-34. So don't get a big head about that there, Gary. But it just tells you the power of the media. So once we started reaching those people, we were talking to the folks that we wanted to reach. Obviously, now that all that media is gone, activity is down. Our plan now is to go dark while there's all this behind-the-scenes working, and when there's something to announce, we will come back and spin them up again. But I think now that we have a platform to talk to them, they know we're here, and we know how to reach them, and we've proven that we can go get them. So I think it's pretty exciting. You have that. Here it is. The hands-on workshop generated 40 people in attendance. The Charette Studios had more than 30. The Lunch and Learns had 20-plus people. Open houses, 30-plus. And the Work in Progress meeting had 30-plus people. So that's a good turnout. Some of them were obviously not unique visitors, but nonetheless it was attended, and that's good. I will tell you that Dan and my team have been hard at work. I would say a good, what would you say, Dan, 18 hours of work on the website. I would encourage you all to visit the website and see the work that's been done there. The information that is disseminated on that website is remarkable. We are alerting the public of the work that's in progress. We're letting them know what has been done to date. There's not a gap. They know what's been done to date and what's coming, and how they can participate. So I would encourage you to tell your friends and neighbors, they're not behind, they can catch up, it's all there. It's pretty user-friendly. We've made sure that, you don't have to be a planner to understand it. I get it. If I get it, anybody can get it. And Dan's been very patient with our team because we need hand-holding. And also the outreach programs, all the outreach efforts are posted there. Quick question, how many of you did get to see any of the television or radio outreach that we did? Anybody? You did? Okay. Okay, but you saw it. I really would encourage you to take a look at it because it kind of, I don't want to say dumbs it down, but it makes it user-friendly. It puts it in terms that us people that aren't used to living in the planning world can understand. And obviously that's what needs to happen. So I think Kim did an awesome job, and if you have 5 minutes to go look at the M. Buffalo one or the Janet Snyder presentation, it might help you talk to your friends about it because like I said, it puts it in user-friendly terms. And it would help our outreach as well. So spend some time doing that.
Thank you.
Anybody have any questions about outreach? No. Thank you.
Yeah, if you have it, it's on the Imagine Amherst website. Take a look at both of those. It was pretty interesting just to see. I have a concern. There's been a couple letters to the Buffalo News, and there's been some comments that I've heard. People in the public who know that I have something to do with this committee have talked to me. And I'm not sure that the public at large understands what we're trying to do, and despite the effort that these guys are making. My bookie. wants to know where the money is from the Bills game on Sunday. Anyhow, I'm not 100% sure that people really understand what we're trying to do, because the letters that were to the Buffalo News and some of the comments that I've heard, people think that what we're trying to do is reinvent Amherst in total. And we're not trying to do that. We're trying to look at development, redevelopment really, of existing centers and the relationship those centers have to a number of things, including density, including mixed use, including relationships to neighborhood developments. What we're looking at is what potentially can happen. We're not saying it has to happen. We're not saying it absolutely is going to happen, because very frankly, if people like David and people like Carl decide they don't want to do redevelopment, none of this will ever take place. What we're saying is that in order to be competitive going forward, and talking about competitive in the environment that we're in, not competitive against the other towns, just competitive in the world, we have to advance ourselves and we have to move forward. And we have to make people understand that we've got to look at what's coming up next. There are some of us in this room, including myself, who may never be around to see some of this happen. But future generations should benefit from what we're trying to do today. And anybody who has a comment that is not in line with what I'm saying and thinks that we're wrong needs to speak up. So it's good to hear from people that they don't think that we're doing the right thing. That's fine, because you have to get the negatives along with what you think are the positives. But at the same time, I think what Annette was saying holds a lot of water. When you have an opportunity as a member of these committees to go out and to talk to people in the community, you've got to try and explain to them that we're trying to look to the future. And again, nothing is set in stone. Nothing says that absolutely positively that's the way we have to go just because it's up there from a charrette. But it's a guide, it's a plan to where we think we need to go in order to make sure that we stay competitive. So if you have an opportunity when you're talking to people, and it's absolutely amazing, a couple of people have come up to me and said, boy, you guys are really trying to snow us with this thing. Okay? You want to put 5-story buildings up every place in town. Well, that's the furthest thing from the truth that that's not what we're trying to do. So if you have an opportunity and you can talk to somebody and you can tell them what we're really trying to do here, it would be a big help. And the other thing too, if you know a magic formula that's going to bring out 150 or 200 people to one of these meetings, that would also be helpful too. So.
I think the thing you do, Dale, is to talk about the president report for government.
Okay. How about if we talk about Gary? Let's talk about the ZBA memos and see if anybody has any comments on those. Gary Brendel and Duncan Black have taken the time to put together a couple of memos talking about what some of the problems are that they encounter, some of their pet peeves, and some of the meetings that they're having. Have you all had an opportunity to look at those memos? And if you have, do you have any comments?
Duncan, correct me if I'm wrong, just a little bit of context. We understood that there could be, outside of the commercial activity centers, as the focus of this study, we understood there could be some housekeeping zoning issues addressed. Several of these items are not commercial related. Certainly temporary uses and signs. Did we put signs in there, Duncan? Signage are two of the bigger ones. The others are issues that have just come up several times in the last year or so, and we thought that if we have the opportunity to have the consultants look at some of these questions, it would be beneficial. Of course, this committee's got to agree on the questions.
Exactly. We have made sure that Lee has copies of these, by the way, so that when they're looking at the code, okay, where it's appropriate, they can make adjustments or they can make suggestions on the content of both of your letters. But from the committees, okay, any comments, any thoughts? Mr. Pigeon. Gary and Duncan, did you speak with Commissioner Building, have a dialogue with him, especially things like the temporary use permits where you're alluding to the fact that maybe the Commissioner Building would have the power to renew temporary use permits? Did you get any feeling from him how he felt about that?
Okay. Yes, I've had conversations with him, and what we're trying to do with some of these is see if there's a way to ease the workload both in your department and for the ZBA. Because there are times where you have to review all of these as a building department, and if you can just make the decisions, they don't have to come to ZBA. And that's what we're really trying to look at. We're not trying to get rid of any responsibilities of the zoning, but if there's a way to speed up the process, make it easier on both our groups and the residents, that's what we've been looking at.
Regarding the temporary use, the question about leaving it in building was primarily for renewals of temporary use permits. There's a bigger question about temporary use permits. Do we have a better way to let some of these uses go forward, other than a use variance or rezoning, maybe reframing temporary use so it's not so temporary, because most of what come to us for a temporary use permit, the owners have no intent in making them temporary.
I just wanted to bring it out to everyone just to get some dialogue going. I'm aware of the situation, but I don't know if there's an easy answer to this right now. There seems to be more and more temporary use permits going out because of uses in general in our zoning ordinance, and people are trying to involve themselves in some kind of use, on a temporary basis, but like we said, in a lot of cases I've seen that go on for years and years and years and years and years, and some of them almost as long as I've been here, so, I mean, there's got to be a different avenue or some approach to try to change the way we do that. Now, I don't know if Commissioner Building should have that much power over these temporary use permits, because there has to be some public input to it. And I understand that if you have the first one, you have the public hearing, and it gets approved, and then if there's not any complaints, or maybe it should be that the Commissioner Building would then say, I don't feel comfortable with this, I'm not going to approve it, let it go back to the Zoning Board of Appeals. Maybe that'd be an avenue to take, because there's in some cases, it really, to give that to Commissioner Building or anyone to just renew temporary use permits, I can't see it. I'm sorry. He's not here, but I've been there long enough, and I've seen what happens in our office when these temporary use permits go through. And to let one individual have the ability to make that decision is pretty significant.
Okay, I'm not in disagreement with that, Bill, at all. That's one of the things that we've been wrestling with. And I also think that a number of these are really specific to the areas that we're looking at in our study right now. And I think a perfect example of it is Walmart, the Walmart over on Sheridan. They come in every year for a temporary use permit for storage trailers to handle the holiday season. They want to come in from basically now through to the first of the year, and then the trailers are supposed to go away, which they did last year. But that's obviously going to become, year after it's been now, 3 years, I think, that they've been doing this. It'll continue. I mean, I don't see them stopping that. So is there a way to ease the whole process, or either just say no, because temporary trailers are not allowed in the town, except during some construction time, but just as storage trailers, no. So do we just enforce it and say no, make them build a building if they need added space or whatever? I mean, this is what we're wrestling with. why we brought it up, because as you start developing more commercial centers, this is likely to become a continuing issue.
I had some, excuse me, I had some concerns in regard to temporary uses. I've had those concerns for a long time and never really had the opportunity to voice them in a forum like this. But it seemed to me that those permits are sort of hedging on some of the responsibilities, other responsibilities of the Zoning Board of Appeals, and that is to hear cases in regard to use variances. And it also hedges on the responsibilities of the town board, who have the unique authority for establishing where individual zones are, and those zones essentially establish what the use is going to be. I think what can happen over time is an individual gets a temporary use permit, makes investments in that property. It's very, very difficult to say now, it's not temporary anymore, you have to stop what you're doing after all that investment takes place. So I think we need to take a closer look at that technique in very broad terms, as opposed to kind of trying to tweak it and fix it. How do we fix the process of reapproving them? I think maybe we should have a different look at that particular technique.
I have a question regarding temporary use permits relative to chickens and now pigs. When this thing first came up, when chickens first came up a number of years ago, I remember talking to Gary Black, and I believe the planning department's direction to the town was that they didn't think it should be approved. But it was approved, and I appeared in front of the board and said that it's a slippery slope because people will be wanting to include other animals, in which now we come to the pig. I was just talking with Gary here, and he feels that maybe this is not a land issue, but I think he's right. It should be settled by the town board. And I'd be interested to see what other cities are doing, and you could ask the gentleman, you know, in his travels, and he deals with a lot of cities, as to how do they address that? Because as a homeowners association president, get a lot of opposition to that. And the main objective, or the main detractor is that if you want to sell your house, and the people that come look at it and find out there's a pig next door, the house value automatically goes down, and that's a fact. You can talk to realtors, and I have, and that's a fact. And I don't think that people have the right, if they want to keep what I consider a farm animal in a residential zone district. If they want to grow pigs or keep pigs and horses or cows, they should go out in the suburban agricultural district, not in the residential district.
Just to be clear on my one person on the ZBA's position, and I did talk to the commissioner after that pet pig issue came up, micro pig. My point was, it's not really a land use if it's a pet, and it came to us as a use variance, which seemed impossible, pushing rope uphill. I think if that had come to us as an interpretation, we would have had a different discussion, and probably a different outcome. And it just goes to my point where I don't think it's a land use that should be regulated through zoning. Pets shouldn't be regulated through zoning. You know, if the town board wants to regulate it a different way, that's great, but I just think it's tough to do it as a land use. It's livestock by the definition of our code.
Certain livestock are only permitted on farms. So when someone comes in, the only option they have is to go to zoning board of appeals. That's how it's in the situation. You allow them to buffalo, and an individual insider decides they want that chicken. That's under the former commission. And so the only option we had is because they had coops or hogs or whatever, the definition of livestock on farms, and then they had to, they're only allowed to have them on farms, so that's the only option they had. Then it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. More people got involved, and that's how it ended up with the regulations. Do I personally like the idea of capping the situation? No, because it becomes quite a hassle for us, because then we go around, somebody putting a rooster, there's a rooster. up and, to find out whether there's a roof or not. It sounds funny, but it's like, this is not one or two times that it's happened.
But I agree with you about the definition of livestock, which, but the intent of the zoning, I think, was to define things as livestock, to help define the land use of an agricultural land use or farm, but that's not what was before us. And my whole point is, pets, the type of pet someone has, shouldn't be regulated as a land use. It may be regulated a different way by the town board.
Can I just, because we had to deal with the chicken question in the village, and I've had this question come up when I teach zoning and planning board trainings in Western New York. And the first half of my zoning and planning board trainings, if it's more of like a motivational speech, it's okay to say no. And we go through a million ways and try to get people all to pass a microphone around and say no into the microphone. But the issue that I see, because you could say, well, the town board issue, town should pass a local law. Well, the town has a law, and the law says no. So if you're, if you're saying, well, the town board should deal with that, well, that's in place. And if the town board really wanted livestock, then they could open it up and pass an affirmative, but void of them passing an affirmative, the answer right now is no. So, and the same thing goes with every other special use permit, right? The answer starts off as no. So, it's all right to just end it at the zoning board level and say no. But if the zoning board really feels that there's a reason for an exception, then that should be voted on there. It shouldn't come down to staff within the town who, if they make the wrong decision, are responsible to those people who are elected and hired them to defend that position. It should come to the board, and the zoning board should really look at it and say, is this something that we're willing to exempt from town code? We're willing to go so far as to give you a temporary exemption from code. And if the answer is yes, it's so overwhelmingly important, then so that's a long way of saying I think all special use permits need to stay at the board level. They have to be voted on. Because otherwise, who's to say, well, Walmart's trucks are important in the holiday season. Well, to Walmart they are, but to the people behind the Walmart, or people have to look at them, or to other businesses in the area, they might not be. So what's the argument? And that can only be made by a voting body, and it should never come into staff level.
Okay, good comments. In the meantime, we asked Lee to look at it, if he can come up with something, but I think that the comments were good, so thank you for the discussion. Yeah, Dan.
Just a quick, some of the other communities are doing it as, that with the animals as local laws, and they have to apply for an animal permit. I think it was through the town board, so it's not land use. How some other communities are doing it. With the temporary use permit, at the county level, we review a ton of them, and if we could extend just the duration of them, so we're not renewing them every 6 months, from the county level, that would be very helpful. So, there's no countywide impacts, and so.
But if you're issuing temporary use permits for 6 months, at 6-month intervals, it means you really want something to be temporary. So if somebody comes back after 6 months, the answer probably should be no to begin with. If you're willing to grant it for a year or 2 years because there's some overwhelming need and you're going to let people make investments, maybe it shouldn't be a temporary use permit anymore.
Some of the other communities are 2 years.
Whatever.
So.
Still comes in.
What I wanted to add, it didn't have anything to do with, I was surprised to see the questions posed to the technical advisory body, and my question is, does anyone else have that ability now to pose questions? I think there's some structural deficiencies within our zoning law. In particular, I've expressed it to both Gary and Rick, and that's we don't have good standards for site plan approval. The only thing we do have that closely resembles standards is in the new community district. So I guess my question to Lee or to anyone is, do we have the ability to suggest that we look in greater depth? I'm assuming we're looking at the entire zoning law and not just, and where does the technical advisory committee stand on some of the structural deficiencies within the zoning law?
Because you'd have to, like, use the remote and click shit. It would drive you crazy.
I like this one better.
So.
Thank you. The mission of the Technical Advisory Committee is essentially to review, a technical review of the documents that are put out as part of the study. But as you're speaking, what I'm thinking here is that, you know, we've been focusing on the commercial areas and what needs to be done in terms of changing the regulations in those areas. But also, one of the components of this study is to take a broader look at the zoning code. And a number of things have been mentioned in the process, particularly during the charrettes, that have sort of smacked of the need to take another look at process. And I think what you're talking about is related to that. I think going down the road with this initiative, that we have to look at that. So hopefully, when we're all finished here, that those issues will be thoughtfully addressed. But going back to your initial question, is that something that you bring to the Technical Advisory Committee? I would say no. Bring it to this group, and as we go through this process, then it will go through the Technical Advisory Committee. I said no.
Hey, Lee.
Yeah.
Just talk for a second.
Well, in the meantime...
Check.
Again.
Test 1, 2.
People hear that or not? Yeah. All right, look at, so let's try this. Let's try and do this through the phone. I think the sound is not going to be particularly good, but if we kind of go forward. I'll see if this works a little better, but we'll try this. See if we can pick you up on it.
Dan's avocation's IT,
Right.
by the way, in
Please
case
talk
anybody
now.
is interested.
Okay, testing. 1, 2. Check.
All right, let's go ahead, and why don't you go ahead and get started, and we'll just do this with the audio.
I'm glad to. So should we start with the precedent report?
No, let's go right to the other one.
So the charrette report.
In case my battery falls out.
Okay. The committee should have copies of the charrette report. They are principally a summary of the activity for the week while we were there. And I guess I'd like to raise some key issues out of that week. And if possible, talk with you guys a little bit about those key issues, and then talk about sort of next steps and how we can take what we learned from that week to help us move forward with the project. So I think first and foremost, as a report back, we felt we had very good attendance. I know that some who were involved felt the attendance was low, but it was as strong as we typically get during our charrette work. Zoning is not the hottest item to bring people out, especially on a Saturday morning. So we felt fairly good about the outcome based on the number of people that participated during the course of the week. I will say that, as I suspect many of you already know, there are some very strong voices in the community, and it was hard sometimes for others to be heard as much as anything because they chose not to speak up in the face of some of those stronger voices. Because of that, we always use multiple ways to gather input during the week. So if you glance at some of the actual comment cards and things in the charrette report, you'll get a fairly different picture than necessarily you would have just listening to the actual course of the meetings. So I think one of the things that we have to just be cognizant of is that there is a somewhat silent portion of the community that is strongly in support of many of these ideas. So I think we should not lose sight of that as we begin to move forward. I think no matter what, it is very clear that the two key issues that we are wrestling with have nothing to do with mixed-use development or walkability or any of those questions. They are totally about the height in whether it's appropriate in various areas, and the immediate transitions to neighbors right behind development. Those transitions, whether they're land use transitions, landscape transitions, no transition at all, as is true in many cases today, are one of the key talking points. So what this exercise needs to work out is how can we resolve some of those height and transition questions. I think the other thing that we learned during the course of the week, because we had Dave Ursell there, and we had a chance to hear at least a summary of his report findings, I think we've discovered that there are some challenges in the marketplace for Amherst. You're competing with the entire region there, and in fact, in many ways, you're competing with the entire country for continuing the kind of development that has been bread and butter for you, which is the large-scale office development that's been occurring and supported by the IDA and others. And so you currently, as we went around town and were taking photos and working in our pilot areas, saw a lot of vacancy, and that implies, a lot of suffering on the part of landlords. It implies tax impacts for the town. And so one of the things that comes to mind from us is that based on Dave Ursell's work, based on our own work in other communities, there is a need for rethinking the patterns of development, at least in some portions of the community. That's what the precedent report was about. That's what many of these pilot center studies are about. What we're talking about is what kinds of forms of development will carry the town in and through the next 10 or 20 years. How do we make sure that the lifeblood of the community, meaning commercial activity, which pays serious taxes and helps out the residential tax base, maintains its strength and viability in the town? If we emptied out all the commercial centers and all we had were a few hotels or whatever, we wouldn't have a very strong economy. So I wonder if anybody has any thoughts, after looking at the 6 pilot centers, about either the height or the transition questions that they are interested or willing to share with me. Just barely.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so just make sure you use the microphone. Anybody got anything?
Specific to height and transition, we've had some people come into village board meetings talking about the Amherst, talking about this project, and some of the concern is what happens to not just the surrounding neighborhoods in terms of how the building abuts or how the buildings on a site abut the neighborhood, but what happens where ingress and outflow of traffic take place. And I think that's something that we've started to deal with a little bit, but I think that's anytime you sort of start to to load parking at the rear of a building and start using side streets as connection points, you automatically start to run into conditions where vehicle volume and flows start to change. So I think that's just something we have to pay attention to. I'm sorry, I should have said this is Brian Culpa from the Village of Williamsville, and that's something that I know residents within the village were concerned about and expressed some concern about. And I do have one comment. It's not a height or transition comment for the sort of west of village, the area, study area. I don't know if you want those now, or should we hold off and finish height and transitions first?
I'm game to hear you finish your thought.
Okay, so I've thought about this graphic a lot since we saw it, and it's this very striking sort of diagonal following the old rail line, basically. There's in your words, a gateway element, right, sort of a main gate, and then you've got this new multi-purpose trail, which is awesome, and if if the right developer who held the right building between the village and the town said, hey, maybe there's some way to work in a trail connection, this could connect directly into the Lehigh Memory Trail that runs through the village. And actually form a sort of mile-long walking and pedestrian trail. But then what happens once you get into the gateway, because we're center loading all the parking, is that grand trail is basically fronted on both sides by parking. So here we're asking people to walk in, kind of teasing that there's something prominent there, and the reveal is, yeah, you can walk on this path through a parking lot. While certainly having buildings front on Main Street makes sense, and I understand why the interest in wrapping the perimeter of the site, I actually think that more feature, either heavy landscape feature or building mass, ought to conjoin that trail and have some of the parking pushed to the perimeter. If that trail element is...
I mean, you raise an interesting question, and one of the challenges here is balancing some nominal amount of structured parking, which is shown in the back of that site, with the surface parking, which is really what the market can afford today. So that, I mean, that is definitely a struggle. If we just go back to an example like Northtown, and think about the vast parking lots that are there supporting a single-story model of development, and what we need to then, shift and support a multi-story model of development. I mean, we have a real challenge, because perhaps the village is not there, but most of the town is going to struggle with the inability to provide structured parking, and therefore the need to be at 3 stories maximum and have a component of surface parking included. But yes, there could be a number of ways to design that site, and the regulations can certainly set out something that gives you a stronger edge along trails if that's a desire of the community. There would be trails in a number of settings, we would hope, throughout the town, that are associated with these places. That's one of the ways you get back and forth to the trails to the commercial areas is by having those. So, so I think that's a great idea.
I want to repurpose part of the question here for a moment, because on that same drawing you have B, public green serves as new gathering space, and it's sort of pushed to the back of the lot along it's not Union Road, but along that new road that's created. It would seem to me that public green wants to be sort of centralized inside of the gateway element. Whether or not somebody actually builds a gateway that's a structured building, or whether some other public access or public entryway, that the green is just sort of haphazard off to the side. That should really be the central element. Then you have this trail connected to a very, targeted destination, kind of an impetus for people to walk on that trail to get to a gathering point.
Yep. So the location, which may or may not be appropriate, certainly a topic for discussion. The location was selected to support the activity further back and sort of draw you into the site. So there is some thought of trying to activate that rearmost portion of that site, because actually behind that very large building is also a town park with the swimming pool. So it's kind of like, how would you get these people, through this very, very deep, very large site? So part of the way that you would potentially do that is to drag them forward by having that green space, and really you would anticipate the developer to kind of take maximum advantage of that is going to put restaurants and other active uses right up against that green space. If it's too close to Main Street, they might not choose to put those same kinds of uses there. The open space might be a good gathering space, but it might not be as effective a front door, if you will, for new development. So a balancing question for someone designing development on the site. None of what you're seeing in that example would be coded except perhaps the percentage of the site that needs to be in open space and how open space is supposed to act. So the individual site plan that might come in, you might find 5 different variations of how that site plan might come through. But we do have to decide on some of these fundamentals, like do we really believe in that trail system? And that, therefore, that diagonal through the property, because that's a really key feature that a future developer would have to respect if we do believe in it.
I'm still holding the mic, so I'm going to take one more shot. Yes, the trail system works because there's an immense amount of people who use the trail system through the village. And if it were to connect through to this trail system, it would work, supplied there were vistas or items for people to go to on the trail. So what I'm suggesting, again, is to turn on the drawing the public green to the inside and then shift the buildings to the inside to be along that trail so that you had sort of a grand pedestrian plaza on which restaurants could front and a public green where you could have, outdoor markets or festivals.
So I'm all for that. I have no problem with that fundamentally. One of the questions is, when you look at that now in plan view, in 2D, where does the 5 stories fit? Because part of what we were doing there was pushing the 5 stories substantially back from Main Street. And that seemed to be one of the driving elements of the discussion about the existing buildings right at the edge of the village, was the intensity and height right at the street. We're quite comfortable with the notion of building up even more intensely on that site, for example, and certainly of bringing some of that mass forward. That would make the transition on the backside much easier. So I'm open to that. If people are comfortable with that idea, we're certainly open to rethinking the way our 2-dimensional coding for that might work.
My experience is that over 4 stories, even in this area, just gets killed publicly. I mean, the village actually lowered our height from 6 to 4 because there's an intolerance really for anything over 3. Now, this isn't the village, but I'm guessing that our neighbors aren't going to be so far off of that thought. So I know you've got it coded for 5. I'm telling you, I think 5 turns out pitchforks. I would encourage you to probably look at doing 4, and instead of trying to jam a 5-story building or 5-story structures to the back of the site, do more 4-story density, internal to this thing along a trailway.
Certainly worth discussing, and I guess the biggest challenge with 4 is it makes complete sense to me when you're stepping down to 3 and 2-story development immediately behind. This site doesn't have that problem behind it. It sits up against the city park and not against any single-family homes on the backside. So we were hoping, if there were anywhere, this was one of the correct places to put that kind of height. Now, if we want to shift gears just slightly, you may remember that there were 2 drawings for Northtown of the same street, one shown at 3 stories in height, and one shown with 2 more stepped back on the top of the exact same building. I don't know how much time anybody spent looking at those, but I think for the most part, most people would agree the street feel is fundamentally the same for the 3-story at the street version and the 5-story with the step-back version. So is that perhaps a tool that we can use on the street side, whether it's Main Street or any other street, to sort of ameliorate that impact we're talking about?
No. I've lived it for 9 years on this question of height and density. We've tried every which way to talk to people about height and density. We have this tentative 4-story allowance in the village, and beyond that, it's pitchforks and torches. So fine. I'm just telling you from an elected's experience where the population turns out.
This is David.
Would that, Brian, in your mind, would that also apply out at Northtown?
I couldn't tell you on Northtown because I don't know what the massive population nearby is. The problem on Main Street is pure traffic volume and people's inability to use north-south routes because they're already over capacity. So when you have every intersection on Main Street and all of your north-south routes turning out as Fs on DOT's standards, people have an intolerance to density, and that's what we're seeing.
I was just going to comment on, just wrap up the West Village. I sat at that table for that part of the design shred on a Saturday, and part of the challenges of this big block here where the supermarket currently is that as you get to Main Street, they're separate parcels, so you don't have common ownership, like Northtown Plaza is under one ownership. So to the extent that, Benchmark, which owns the plaza, never acquires the parcels on Main Street, but somebody else wants to redevelop Key Bank, or somebody else wants to develop the Wendy's and the other things, they have to have the ability to do that, and since they are up on Main Street, the plan was to kind of, okay, how do we let these parcels continue to be distinct and separate from the supermarket property and be developed in a character that we think is appropriate for Main Street, and then allow the supermarket plaza, to the extent it gets redeveloped, to kind of have its own identity, but allow them to happen distinct. Now, if, Benchmark, the developer that bought all of the parcels around it, kind of reprogram the entire site, then a plan like this could probably, or a plan like Brian was talking about, could probably exist because they control all these surrounding parcels. But given the current lay of the land where they're separately owned, I think it would be hard to kind of cause people to have developments or properties on Main Street that don't really abut this kind of former rail line to actually kind of embrace it because they just don't have the connection to it through their physical ownership.
Committee feel as far as height and the rest of the town is concerned? Would a site like Northtown, to answer Lee's question, be appropriate for 5 stories?
Well, I will say this, we had an interesting dynamic at our table. So I had, and I'm sure it's one of the folks that shows up at Brian's meeting often, showed up at this meeting, and she was very outspoken, and she's also, I would say, of the senior citizen category, because that's important to the point I'm going to make in a minute, who was very opposed to anything happening anywhere in the village or the town that's resulting in height and further traffic. To the right of me was a younger woman, I'm going to say probably in her young 30s, maybe late 20s, embracing the fact that she actually wants to see greater density and height. And the person on the left, the older person who didn't want to see that at all, just was really receptive to it all. So I said, okay, I almost said her name, but so-and-so on the left, okay, there has to be some point where this can happen. So you're telling me that can happen anywhere, and you're basically shutting off this population representing this person here who wants to see this kind of stuff? So the question is, not that it can't happen, but where can it happen? Now, once I posed that question, I got kind of a reluctant concession to the fact that it has to happen somewhere, but you couldn't tell me where. What concerned me about this, and it goes back to the bigger topic, is that I think that there's a large population that would like to see more density, but they're not the ones that are rendering their comments. And at the end of the day, all this gets delivered to the town board that then has to make a decision. And if the only written comments are the ones that are saying we don't want to see this, and that's what they think represents the majority, unfortunately we're wasting our time. Hopefully they'll have the foresight to know they're elected to represent 122,000 people, not the 40 that showed up. So that's my editorial piece for the night, I guess.
In answer to Dale's question, if we look at Northtown in particular, in the question of a 5-story, I'll go back to my original concern. It's dependent on parking structures. And my biggest concern is if we're going to allow something as tall as 5 stories, I don't want to see it to be an island, a 5-story building with an island of surface parking. So that's my concern is can we regulate the ratio of massing to surface parking? And I mean, that's the biggest concern. If we can't get a build-out of all of these structures, then we don't see that form established overall. So that's my concern with allowing something too tall while still allowing a lot of surface parking.
And that's a point we'll take, but I still go back and I still ask basic question. And I think that's what Lee is asking at this point too. Is 5 stories acceptable in the town of Amherst? Forgetting about the village for just 5 minutes, okay? Is 5 stories acceptable in the town of Amherst?
Steve Herberger, I think on a limited basis, there is an application for 5 stories. I think the principles that we've been looking at, where we're tiering development from the lower views and kind of hiding the application of the 5 and story building works. The problem is when we lay the 5-story building up against a street and then tier it only in one direction, somebody still sees the broad wall of a 5-story building. So in certain applications where there's enough space for development on all perimeters of it, where, you know, it could be shielded by a 3-4-story application and then a 2-story down to the residential level, you might have some room for 5-story development. Although in Amherst, I think it's kind of limited at this point. There might be a few sites for application of that. They'd have to be larger parcels.
Lee, any comment on that?
I couldn't quite hear it. I apologize.
So this is David again. So, I mean, I think the answer to the question is basically looking at what's already here. So if you look at the interchanges of the town of Amherst, there's 4 of them. With limited exception, that's where your taller buildings exist and have existed for decades. And it makes sense because at those interchanges, you've got a lot of space. I mean, the highway itself has got width. So within the context of the surrounding area, there's room for it. There's spacing for it. And that's why they kind of gather there. That's where your larger developments are gathered. That's where the zoning permits it. The campus of UV, you know, the North Campus, certainly has a lot of taller buildings. They don't seem out of context with anything because it has a sheer volume of land that allows it to be spaced properly. But if you get into dense areas where you've got, you know, single-story homes or single-story buildings, and you pop a tower there, it's going to look kind of foolish. I mean, some would say that the towers in the Village of Williamsville kind of looks a little foolish where it is. Well, that was 40 years ago, however long it was, and perhaps it was. We've kind of gotten used to it, but if we're looking at that today, we'd say, well, that looks kind of foolish, doesn't it? But I think the town's patterns for height have been well established for decades. Take height off the table. The other interchanges had already demonstrated that. We're just continuing that. So I think the answer to the question is yes, where those patterns already exist. I don't think we have to create new areas for it. And maybe it could exist at Northtown because it's a pretty big property, but it would have to be done very carefully so that by the time it reaches the crust of that site, it begins to scale down.
Let me ask you a question. How many stories is that Dent building?
A little bit.
The Dent building, I'm not really sure, but I'm going to say I've been in the building a number of times. I'm going to say it's either between 8 and 10 stories.
And we never hear any comments on the Dent building, do we?
No, it's got a lot of, but it's got, you know, it's spaced properly and it borders a highway.
Well, that's my point.
You're not picking up any of this?
A sense of it is all.
On the height issue, I think areas specifically, as David said, at the interchanges, the areas in front of near UB, areas off Sweet Home, Maple Road, there's places where the infrastructure could accommodate that height, that density. And I think that what we have to do here is be careful. I've made this mistake before, is to be careful to not separate the conditions of the intersections and road system from the building mass that we want to place on that road system. So where road systems can accommodate the volume of traffic, right? Places along Sheridan Drive, places along Maple Road, places out near UB, where you have Millersport and Audubon and all that sort of coming in to play in the 990, you certainly could go vertical and get away with it without a lot of hesitation. You know, Edwardsville, Snyder, Williamsville, some of Gettsville, it's probably a lot harder to do because North Forest and Youngs Road, those places start to hit their sort of maximum capacity.
No, this is probably well taken. I think you're... Can I... Lee, are you listening?
Yes.
I'm going to try and summarize a bit if I can, okay? And I'm going to talk loudly so you can hear me. But I'm going to ask the committee a couple of questions. The first question is, looking at the village or the entrances to the village, both to the east and to the west, would it be agreeable to say that perhaps we would prefer to have a maximum of 4 stories coming in and out of the village, but elsewhere where appropriate in the town of Amherst, 5 stories is acceptable? Is that a good statement to make? On larger lots. Lee, did you get that? And
Outside of major highways.
right, where appropriate, right. Right, completely different. Yeah. Taking the commercial size into account. Lee, did you get that?
Enough of it to know what you're talking about, and yes, we could do that in the plan amendment, yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Lee, I know you gotta run in about 10 minutes.
Did you want to talk a little bit about the next steps at the town board before I go?
Yeah, well, there's 2 pieces to that. One, definitely want to talk about the town board. The other thing I think would be for you to maybe talk a bit about the approach that you're going to take from here, because I think we're starting to allude to the fact that we're going to maybe use the zoning and we're going to use these concepts to start to back into the plan amendment. Do you want to explain that process a little bit?
Sure. So I guess one of the things that we proved to ourselves while we were there is that you really need an intimate knowledge of each of these centers in order to be able to make final decisions about these questions that we're talking about here, like height. Because we can't run an exercise on every one of, I don't know, what were there, 52 or 57 centers or whatever, we've got to figure out a way to sort of back our way into that, as Dan was saying. So what we suggested is that we work a little bit on the actual rules that would apply to the 6 pilot centers that we truly know already. And once we have sort of figured out how those rules work, where height is appropriate, how transitions work, how much open space, what is the lot coverage, how are we going to deal with the parking standards, once we have figured out that sort of package of rules, we'll find ourselves with some sets of packages of rules that hopefully when we look at additional centers that match the center type that we were originally crafting the rules for, we would be able to apply those rules again. Perhaps with no modification, perhaps with modest modification. But that's what we're thinking about doing is actually, if you will, coding the 6 pilot centers and then starting a conversation about if this were the code, would you be comfortable with the result of this code in this place? And so example would be that 4 and 5 stories that we were just talking about west of Village. You know, clearly we can craft it for 5 stories. We can craft it for 4 stories with a setback to 5 stories. We can craft it for 3 stories with a setback. You know, I mean, we can work through the iterations of how to think about that and how much parking it would require and how much open space and how the open space should be sited on the site and how trails should be treated. Some of those things need to be dealt with at the zoning level so that people begin to understand them. And by people, I mean especially the committee and the staff as you begin to work with us on figuring out the rest of the plan amendment. And the idea would be then, once we had those patterns down, we could test those against all of the other sites around the community. And by test, I don't mean necessarily, you know, draw the same kind of little drawings, et cetera, that we were doing, but fundamentally just to think about the opportunity sites there, which sites might change. If they changed, would we like the end result that came out of the zoning on those sites? Would it be too intense? Would it be acceptable? That's the kind of thinking that we would like to do. Once we then kind of settle on which zoning districts we would be comfortable applying out of our set crafted from the pilot centers, we would be able then to reverse engineer out the way that the comprehensive plan has to treat the series of centers. Which one should be colored as the same flavor or not? What are these rules for the application of this zoning? You know, do we need, for example, infrastructure and other kinds of things in place? ways that we could differentiate where it is appropriate in the town to use zoning districts, so that we don't end up with the result that we have today, which is, GB everywhere and then customize during the zoning process. Can we customize in advance and actually be ready to apply that zoning? So that's our thinking, and I wonder whether anybody has any concerns about us moving through the process in that direction. We get to the same result, but it's a little bit reverse engineered.
Okay, I think the view here is that seems like a good way to go forward. And then, do you want to talk a little bit about your presentation to the board next month?
So I believe it's the 21st, is that correct, Dan?
That's correct.
So November the 21st, I'll be back in town, and we are going to get some guidance from the town board on moving forward. That guidance, I hope, is not extremely narrow guidance, like, don't put 3 stories on the Key Bank site in Eggertsville. We're not really seeking that. What we're really seeking guidance on are these same kinds of conversations we've just been having. Is it appropriate for us to take this approach to working through the plan amendment? And have we been doing the right thing to have these conversations with the community? Are we getting the right kind of input? Are you comfortable with us moving forward at this point and actually getting some of this coding done? So that's where we're headed. We'll be asking the town board to actively involve themselves in at least letting us loose. It doesn't mean blessing the end result necessarily, but letting us loose to craft those next pieces. So it would be important for members of the committee who have an opinion on the subject and members of the general public who have an opinion to show up on the 21st and express it so that the town board can make a reasonable decision about how to move forward on this project.
Yeah, I guess any questions about that? Okay, and finally, I suppose, anybody have any comments that they'd like to relay to Lee regarding the precedent report? Anything in there that he might be able to answer before we take a look at that and look to maybe finalize that? Lee, did you want to speak just a little bit about what you may or may not be doing to the Charette report here in the next couple of weeks to kind of finalize that?
The key thing with the Charette report is that as it stands today, it is a summary of sort of all of the steps and all of the conversation that was held during the course of the Charette, and it's really not been summed up in any way. And so I think that in conversation with the town staff, we're going to try to summarize the outcomes and sort of, be able to say what are the lessons learned, what did we figure out, and be able then to talk about how that Charette experience impacts how we might move forward in working on these new pieces. So that part in our mind needs to be added to the document. So while we are unlikely to necessarily change any of the renderings or other things, they were a product of a moment in time, we can easily consider changing how we would propose to zone those various places. And so we want that Charette report to be something that people actually continue to look at during the course of this project, along with the precedent report, and be able to tell us, yes, this would be okay, or no, this would not be okay. So that's one of the key things. The other is that if the economic report by David Hercel gets revised and released publicly in time, we'd like to be able to use some of the key findings from that and include that in our document as well. We've included his show, which did have most of his findings, but we'd love to summarize that in some kind of punchy way right up front to help people understand the economic impact of as foreseen by a professional in the economic industry.
Okay, so does anybody have any other questions or comments? Lee's got another meeting to get to. Dave, you got it? Anybody else after David?
So Dave, the only question I have is, in terms of the precedent section, how is this intended to be used or explained as to what the purpose of precedents are? And the reason why I ask that is I always get concerned that people see precedents and they look at a picture like, Braddock Street and Zuma Apartments and think that somehow there's an architectural recommendation being made, which certainly isn't necessarily appropriate for a town like Amherst. But I'm just curious as to how the precedents are being used and whether or not the folks that are primary audience for these precedents understand what they're really intended to demonstrate.
So are you sort of asking how tightly we might code to the site plans that you were seeing?
Well, I asked the question more directly. So if I'm the primary audience, you're just handing out these precedents to me as a town board member or whatever, how am I supposed to interpret your intention by sharing this to me? I mean, we deal with precedents every day, but I'm not sure if folks understand what they're meant to represent, that they're meant to be an example of a real project that's different than the conceptual images that were created in the charrette, that shows how it was actually done in the real world. I mean, what's being done to supplement and explain the purpose of the precedents?
So I guess the key part of the precedent report was to show that some of the ideas are possible. Now, we're not certain that they're possible in Amherst, unfortunately, because, in many cases, these projects have been supported in a variety of different ways that have nothing to do with the marketplace. So as much as anything, they are to provide a visual understanding of some of these ideas in real life, hopefully for the most part in the Northeast, in ways that people can actually look at and relate to. So when I say that's going to be a 3-story mixed-use building, they can get something in their head. And the main reason for the precedent report is really because you don't have that much new development in either the Buffalo, region in general, or certainly in Amherst to point to. If we had to use the building near UB as, the best mixed-use building you've got right now, or if we had to use the Mosey as that, we would get a lot of pushback. So we were just trying to provide a variety of other settings that we thought were realistic and could be developed in the Amherst area, to kind of share those visual images as much as anything.
If we have thoughts after tonight's meeting about precedents for some of these sites that might be better suited, can we just share those via email?
Love to hear about anything else we should be sharing on that, yes. There is actually a longer list on the back that some of you may remember was the original list provided. And then we selected what we thought were, I think, the 10 most appropriate.
Just to reiterate the point about the economic analysis, because I was curious about the progress of that, and to your point earlier, Dale, to answer the question, why are we doing this, I think it would be very key to make sure that that's somehow incorporated into the front of this report when you're distributing it.
Great. Yeah, did you hear that, Lee?
No, I missed that. I apologize.
The economic development reports, if it could be part of that report on when you speak to the town board.
Sure.
Okay, and also the in-depth description of why we're doing this. Ellen.
Okay.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure how this fits in, but I am here from the Conservation Advisory Committee. I think some elements of this plan do address the greatest challenge that we are all going to face in the future, which is the effects of climate change and the need to reduce carbon-based energy generation. So a certain amount of increased density saves energy. There's some nod to public transportation here. I also think that both older adults and young adults might have a preference for
not being isolated far out in the suburbs as things move along. But I am not an expert on zoning. I'd just like to know if there is some potential to build into the code such things as green roofs, solar panels, geothermal heating and cooling, and electric vehicle charging stations. This whole process, after all, is supported by a NYSERDA grant at the Energy Research and Development Agency. And I really do think that the town in the future needs to take this more seriously. The town has chosen to join the Climate Smart Community Initiative, but has done very, very little to actually implement any of that. And the state of New York has a policy of reducing carbon emissions really drastically in the next 30 to 50 years. So I'd like to know how any of that could be incorporated into the plan. Thanks.
Well, first off, can we have some of our height back so we can have some more compact development? Ignoring that, I think the number one thing that we're going to do along those lines is remove the barriers that might exist in today's code. So, you know, can I have the heat pump for a geothermal system in my side yard setback? Probably right now the answer is no, and hopefully in the future the answer could be yes. Am I allowed to put on a green roof? You know, am I allowed to get stormwater credit for my green roof, and if so, how much? Can I get open space credit for providing a green roof? So we will try to answer some of those questions, and I hope be somewhat innovative in that regard, at least as far as we can push the envelope without setting significant requirements that we don't think should exist for other reasons. So, for example, we'll have a requirement for open space, and then can you double dip with your open space and also be using it for your green roof or your stormwater LID or your whatever, you know, whatever those elements are. So I do think we're going to try to move toward a slightly more sustainable development pattern, and at bare minimum, get the rules out of the way of those more sensible patterns.
Okay. I think that was a good answer, Ellen. You agree? Okay. Lee, what else do you have for us before you have to run?
Sorry, I missed that.
What else do you have for us before you have to run?
I could be done right this minute. I have answered all my questions, and I'm hoping that there's somebody there taking better notes than I could take long distance, because I'd have to admit, glancing back over mine, they're not great. But I appreciate your willingness to work with me in this awkward technological way, and I hope you finish out the meeting without quite so much awkwardness in person there. And we'll talk to you guys again soon, and hopefully see some of you on November 21st.
Thanks, Lee. We'll make sure you get copious copies of your notes.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, now Dan can get his phone back. Any other comments that we want to make on Lee's presentation?
I'd like to go back to the, we talked a lot about height, and the subject was height in transitions. And I think sort of one of the ugly sides of increased height is parking. I know he's talking about parking structures for taller buildings, but the transitions are important. And Duncan and I were talking, there's one thing we see often at the ZBA is variances for parking uses or auto uses at the edge of a commercial in the residential. And I hope that as density is increased, height's increased, that when they look at the code, they try to figure out how to make that work so that we're not always being asked to allow parking where in a residential district or closer to a residential district than we should.
If memory serves me correct, I think Lee did mention the fact that they were going to be looking at parking pretty closely, because we do have a lot of problems with that. There's no doubt about it.
I understand parking is transition, but we also got to make the code work so that it doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, agreed. We have the same problems on planning too.
So, Gary, I don't know whether you've done this yet or not, but I think it would be extremely helpful if we give some specific examples of what you're talking about. Maybe not here, but maybe in the same form that you've done with the ZBA notes. the only way that's gonna happen is if we get specific about it.
Yeah. I think we can do that both from the planning perspective too, both. Okay, there's some housekeeping things we have to do. Dan has to file a report with NYSERDA. One of the things that we have to do is talk about the Activity Center precedent report. We already had some discussion on it, but before we say it's okay for him to submit this, is there any more discussion on it?
David, I think your comment earlier, are you suggesting, so yeah, you'd like a little more explanation in the beginning as to how that should be used or viewed, right? Okay, so I think, we're not in a position to finalize that until we get the information that we're looking for. Yeah, is there a consensus on that? Okay, all right. So we're gonna hold on to that until we can get something incorporated into the introduction that addresses that comment. Any other comments about the precedent report?
Just pointing out that in the precedent report, it seems that it's kind of a fairly obvious thing, but that all the tall buildings are on the main streets. So that might be something to keep in mind with the discussion of the 5-story placement. That maybe the market's not going to want the building set back away from the activity centers as much. For instance, in the Williamsville one, it seems to be really away from Main Street and activity centers. So something to keep in mind in the tall building discussion. So.
Okay. So we're gonna procedurally hang on to that report, and we'll talk to Lee and see if we can't get a piece written to incorporate into the introduction there. And I believe we're still gonna be working a bit, as Lee mentioned, on a summary for the charrette report. So I don't think there's any action that need to be taken on that. That said, you've had it for a couple of days. Any comments about the report itself that we should convey to Code Studio?
One brief one. One brief comment is the report starts off with the outreach, but there's not a lot of context or introduction to what the whole report is about. Kind of just jumps right into the outreach piece by piece.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Anybody else?
I think going with what Gary said and what Dal started out the whole meeting with is that each one of these reports that gets done, I think we should put something in it that just says, here's the charge to the committee, that we're looking at X, Y, and Z. It's not the entire zoning for the entire town, because you're going to have to just keep hitting on that and hitting on it to get people to understand it.
I was going to make a comment about the appendix, because some of the exhibits there, I think folks would for folks that aren't in this business every day, take a little while to figure out what the relevance are. But it's an appendix, you can spend, you can't put a whole textbook together here. So I guess I'm offering this comment really with hesitation that you really bother even trying to explain all this stuff. But some of the exhibits here I think are really relevant, but I'm not sure in the appendix folks really understand what the relevance are. But like I said, where do you stop, right?
So just maybe a little introduction to the appendix that basically says these are the following maps are utilized in some form or fashion to help support the analysis. And okay, good. Anybody else? Okay. So Dale, I'll turn it back over to you. Those are the two.
In the movie Philadelphia, there's a great line that Denzel Washington has talked to me like I'm an 8-year-old. Maybe that's what we need to do. We need to be very, very specific. all the way around, so everybody's not a planner. Okay, so, but once those two reports are drafted, we'll get them out to you so that you can look at them again, because we do need to get them submitted. So that'll be coming out. Did everybody have an opportunity to look at the notes from the September 7th and the September 27th meeting? Any comments?
How do you want to explain, Frank, how you go, it's not acceptable unless Brian's moving to the brain. I was
David, where are you? What?
I'm on,
27th?
Okay, just to clarify it, I was talking about the Saturday when I was part of the Snyder-Eggertsville group, and at that group there was a big difference in the opinion of heights of buildings between the seniors and the 20, 25, 30-year-old people. And I was just trying to explain that with that group at that area. And they were saying many of the things that you're doing is, you've got transportation along there, we don't want to drive cars, give us taller buildings, and we're using public transportation to get around. So it ties into all of these issues. It was just a specific item comment, yeah.
I was present on the 27th. That's all I have to say. I had made some, I think, general concern about off-street parking and the use of parking structures. And I think I was the one that said there was it would be about $22,000 a parking space, so. I think Brian corrected me that there would be 12,000 to 15,000 per parking space.
So what are we saying? If you can just...
Attendance.
Yeah. I was in attendance, and then just, with respect to parking structures, that there would be $12,000 to $15,000 per parking space.
just wanted to check other folks' recollection. So when David Russell was doing his summary, he talked about strengths and weaknesses. And my recollection was, because the way it appears here, it's a contradiction, was that we referred to Amherst strengths as still being a strong office and retail location. He was referring to, and I think he specifically mentioned medical and professional office space, because obviously under the weaknesses section, he's talking about suburban business parks, which is very weak. So that folks reading these minutes, to the extent anybody does, other than this group, if they're, I don't want them to interpret that the market's strong for corporate office space while at the same time being weak. I think he's referring to medical professional office, not suburban office.
Once those corrections are made, are we good to go with these? Okay, all right, good. Okay, realizing that the week that the town board is going to be getting a briefing on this is Thanksgiving week, we appreciate the fact that people have plans, but if it's at all possible that you can get out and lend support. I wish Ramona were here tonight, since she's really a very viable member of this committee, and heard the discussion that was taking place, because I think it's going to be important for her to talk to her peers about what we discussed tonight. So I think that it's incumbent upon Dan and I to make sure that she gets a good synopsis of this meeting, so that she understands what the tenor and the flavor of the comments were, and she's able to convey those to her partners. This meeting is going to be very important because I'm going to say this, and I hope you take it in the spirit of which it's intended, but I'm a little concerned about going to the town board, to be very frank with you, because I'm not sure that they're going to buy into everything that we're talking about or that Lee is talking about. And I hope that it doesn't get watered down someplace. Bill's looking at me. I think Bill knows what I'm talking about. Because this is something that's very important, and we need to show up to be able to lend our support to what we agree. And it's okay to disagree, too. I mean, if there's something that you don't agree with, that's fine, too. But I think it would be important to have a good representation of both of the committees there, so we can turn around and say, you know, we've all worked on this, and we believe in what we're doing. I would like to recommend to the town board that they support this effort going forward. Obviously with comments from them, obviously with some guidance from them, not saying that we don't appreciate all that, but I'm just saying that strength in numbers. So if you can get out for that, that would be terrific. And then we're going to have a joint meeting afterwards at 7 o'clock in this room again.
I'll give you a note.
Yeah, that'll work.
Duncan will give you a note.
I just wanted to just say a couple things about the charrette. We've talked about this in-house and the staff, and I want to make clear to folks on the committee, and hopefully this will be clear to the town board, that the purpose behind this activity was not to redesign the Northtown Plaza and Edwardsville and the Village West and the rest of these places. That these images are meant to help us develop the code that might be applied in those kinds of places across the town. So if you were there on Saturday at the opening session, you'd probably have noticed that folks had a terrible time when they threw the map of the whole town down and said, let's figure out, you know, what kind of center goes here and what kind of center. It was not a useful experience at all. And recognizing that, and then thinking about these as what they really are, which are pilot exemplary cases that can be applied to the other places in town. This kind of gives us the groundwork to begin to look at that map in a little more meaningful way, and as we mentioned earlier, to back into what the zoning ought to be in those particular places after we've designated those places as a certain type, gotten a better idea of what those types might be. I've mentioned this to Lee a couple of times. We've talked about this in-house. We really need to emphasize the fact that this was not intended to redesign Snyder or Edwardsville or any place else. That it really is a tool to help us move forward with the larger effort here. So,
Dan, I have a question, and I'm not trying to be critical here. It's a legitimate question I have about the process of this committee. Because it seems like in the past we've raised concerns within committee meetings about subject matter. There isn't a consensus or vote on the comments made. It gets left in the plans and carried over. So, you know, if we're going to endorse something with renderings that show, Dan, I'm going to throw you under the bus for a minute. I'll go with you here. But a number of us had concerns about Northtown and the parking structure and the need to accommodate change there based on this exorbitantly expensive above-ground parking, and, you know, it was sort of explained, well, you can't support this density without it, so we're going to leave it in. I don't know. Maybe the rest of the committee says, nah, people who had that concern are off the rocker and we're all for leaving the graphic as is. But we didn't actually finish that conversation. The consultant just left it in. I raised a concern tonight about West Village. I don't have any confidence, because he said they're not going to change the rendering. I don't have any confidence they're not going to present a graphic with 5 stories on part of the parcel. I'm not going to put my name or endorse something like that. I mean, that's crazy. I know people are going to kill it based on the graphic. So, you know, there was other things. When we talked about sites and site selection, and it was, well, the consultant said, no, we want to stick to these original sites. After that was voted on by this body, that no, we want to switch sites, with a positive vote towards a different site, and no, we're going to switch back to the original sites here. And I guess what I'm asking is, what are we doing? We're talking about these comments, but the renderings and the design keep plunging forward as the consultant envisions them.
So this is the first time we've actually had a chance to talk about these. You expressed your opinion about what you thought in the rendering ought to change. I think Lee heard that. About these?
About the parking specifically, just have, well, this is how we're going to do it.
West Village relies on 2 parking structures.
Right, do we have that conversation?
Are you talking about...
We decide, hey, we want to base this on the idea of creating parking structures. I don't think that as a body we're really giving a ton of say over the output of the consultant.
Okay, I'm not sure I agree with you, but last meeting you're talking about is the meeting at Howland Road? Yep. Okay. Okay, we'll have to go back, and maybe we have a fundamental problem as we just went through these minutes or these notes. We probably should have recorded it a little more carefully than it was. So I would ask you then to, you know, we'll take a look at this and talk to Lee a little bit more about it. If what you're advocating, though, is that the parking ramps come out of the concept, I don't know whether your opinion represents the opinion of everybody here or not.
But we haven't asked that question. I think the comment was brought up, and then it was just sort of passed over and left in.
Okay, well...
Yeah. But Brian, I think what Lee is trying to say that if you were to recommend redevelopment in Northtown, for example, okay, which we're not going to have that much recommendation to be saying because the developer there is really ready to present plans, okay? We would recommend that a parking structure be put in there. The developer may not want to do it.
We're creating a height and mass density based on conditions that you can create a parking structure. And minus parking structure, we're acknowledging that we can't support that height, mass, and density.
And I share the same concern, because how realistic is the vision if it relies on parking structures? That's my primary concern. And I'll own up to it. I mean, parking structures are expensive. And that's my biggest concern is, you know, can we realize this vision without parking structures? Because I don't see the development community paying for parking structures.
But what will happen is the plan and the code says we're looking for 4 or 5-story buildings, and sites don't have enough parking, sooner or later, you know, look, you're calling for 5-story buildings, help us make it work with less parking or some other kind of area. Don't mean to be so negative.
Yeah, if you look at some of these precedent reports and what's happening there, the parking decks, as I read, some of them were actually done by the town or whatever, by a governmental agency. They said, okay, if you're gonna come in and develop this, and you wanna develop X density, we'll develop the park, we'll own it, and we'll get the revenue that comes in from the park.
And I think David Purcell indicated as well that it may require a public-private partnership. I just don't see the private sector funding the parking structure. I agree.
In many cases, the private sector can't in our market. That doesn't happen that often. The underlying real estate values have to be so high. And the most recent example we have of that in the town is, the Elka paid $3.7 million for less than 2 acres of land at Main and Union. So that necessitated a very dense project. They pretty much maxed out the envelope there, and the only way they could do that was to put in structured parking. When you're paying close to $2 million an acre, you have to do that. But there's very few examples in the town where that occurs. The other places where it can happen, and you can look at it, and this is where the IDA comes into play, depending on what the town board does with this, so they can direct the IDA to put in, to facilitate things like tips or other types of things that may help begin to finance parking facilities in private developments. So that's where the incentive piece comes in, and that's kind of the connecting the dots process that has to occur. But within all of that, there's limited exceptions within the town of Amherst or any suburban community where parking structures could be justified. There's just very limited opportunity.
But I guess my question is this: are you not wanting to support the idea of a parking structure, or are you really speaking to what you think is the feasibility?
I personally think I have no concern with the structure itself. I just don't think it's realistic.
But I don't know that. Okay.
Well, what would happen is, so if we take Northtown, so if you tell somebody, listen, you can build up to 5 stories, okay, but now you have to, and you maybe have to achieve a certain density, but that now going to require structured parking. They may have the option, well, I don't want to do structured parking, so now I can't build up to 5 stories, and I'm doing something different. So it's like if you want to encourage density, one of the ways you encourage it is you facilitate it. Now, I'll give you that, but then you got to do this. So I guess it's hand in hand. Then I can choose whether or not I want to go that dense or not. But I think the concern would be, or the problem is, if you mandate 5 stories, you mandate density, and you economically can't justify the structured parking that goes with it, the property doesn't get developed.
I see these more as a statement as to what might be done and how it could be accommodated, not saying there's got to be a parking structure here. So I don't necessarily agree with that.
Well, that's to me the positive of having an image of a parking structure in a suburban community is that it helps suburban dwellers at least get maybe used to the idea that a parking structure could occur, because it's not something you typically see suburban, and most folks really kind of have an aversion to parking structures suburban. So to the extent that may be coming down the pipeline at some point in time, having an image or two in there, even if it's conceptual, that suggests that it could occur, is probably not a bad thing.
Let me ask you a question. 30 years ago, when Galleria was built, do you ever think they'd be putting up parking structures?
I think we came to the realization that they wanted to grow, that they had a tenant mix that desired to be there, and they were willing to pay $20,000 per car park because their tenants all demanded it.
But that could be the case in some of the development here too.
I think it could.
So but we're not demanding, or we're not mandating. We're suggesting that if you want to get density in there, if it's economically feasible for you to do it, that would be okay with us.
And it'll be okay with me as well. I guess I'm concerned that if you have safeguards, I don't want to see tall mass in big field of parking. That's my only concern. I don't want to recreate what we have at Union, the old Laminates, or
Right, yeah. Yeah, where Key Bank is. Yeah. Okay, we kicked that around pretty good. I don't know, did we come to a conclusion now?
Well, so as we work to finalize this thing, I guess what I would ask is that if folks have specific comments about these, that they let us know what they are.
I think what you're saying, I
think between Brian and Dan and Gary and even to some degree David, okay, that we need the committee to come to a determination. Because you might get 3 emails that say one thing, okay, but you're not looking people square in the eye in the emails. So you really need to have a vote here tonight. Right. So let's put it this way. I'm going to oversimplify it, okay? To begin with, should parking structures even be included in this, yes or no? Show of hands, yes. Okay. So I would say that they should be shown. Okay. Yes.
Garages, and I think in conceptualizing that image, seeing okay, what height of the buildings would be without a parking garage? For instance, take away that parking garage, the 5-story becomes a 3, and like what would work, and would you maintain that density? I'm not talking about creating new renderings or anything, but just having that information might help get the point across. So.
And I think, and having those numbers, so it's 5 stories, this is the return. If you don't like 5 stories, you like 3, this is the rate of return. So like having everything clear as day to answer that question, why are we doing this and why do we need 5 stories in certain parts of the town?
So you maintain that mass and still accomplish the mixed-use goal.
So what you're really saying is that they should be in there, but then we should have some options listed and some guidance on those options so that people, if they're going to go in and develop the area, they understand a little more succinctly what we're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, I'll tell you something, guys, and I agree with everything you're saying, but remember something, too. You got to understand that eventually all this is going to come before the planning board anyhow. So the planning board's going to have some options, more options than we have now, as a matter of fact, with this. So we're going to be able to look at it, and we're going to be able to say to people, but if you're going to do this, you need to do that, too. So there's some wiggle room left as far as the planning board is concerned, and then eventually it goes to the town board, too. Yes, David? Okay. Yes.
If you're going to go to 5-story in certain density, that you cannot basically stick that into your parking. If you go to that, then you have to have parking structure. It seems to me, and David, I'd like to have your comment on this, that if you provide enough density, it can skew the economics and be able to financially afford to put a parking garage in. If you don't have that kind of density, you'll never get it done. But if you do have it, it would seem to me, and I'm practicing voodoo economics here, that you should be able to justify the expense of putting a parking garage in.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to say that, at least in my experience, and it's not worldly, but the need for structured parking becomes inherent to the project. Once again, if I'm looking at a particular site that's got a particular value that I'm paying for it, and I know I got to generate a certain number of widgets out of that, the need for structured parking becomes inherent to that. Okay, so Main and Garrison, we have a very expensive piece of property. It's not that big. We're going to have to develop something dense there, and in order to do that, I'm going to have to facilitate parking. Even if the village doesn't have a parking requirement that I have to hit, practically speaking, got to make sure that I can hit that parking, and it may force us to consider some sort of creative parking structure. So having the ability to do that in the village, which the ordinance currently permits, is great. But I wouldn't want to be required to do that, but the value of the property is driving me to consider it. I don't know if that helps or not, but I don't think the coding has to do that much, because the market's establishment of value in that property is going to dictate that more than anything else.
Enable that and provide for the options. Sorry.
By the same token, though, I mean, if economics don't work, you're going to be forced to look at future land values on the
So,
Yeah.
but I think that conceptually, the ability to build a parking deck, fine, I get it, it makes sense. The danger that I see right now, we have some very pretty renderings here, and what we're essentially expressing is that here's the vision for place. If every one of the renderings maxes out the land use, you're essentially turning it over to the community and say, we're hoping to max out the land use everywhere. The best rendering on the entire set is the second North Towns rendering that shows different examples of height, right? It's saying, we envision that it could go this high, but based on the graphic scale, we think it'll probably top out here. So if we push the envelope and put the deck, if we push the envelope and put the 5 stories, if we push the envelope on every single one of these packages, then what I'm already hearing from the public, and not just Williamsville, but people outside the village who have talked to me about this, is the graphics seem that you want to maximize the town of Amherst and just push the envelope everywhere. If this is a zoning package, and this is a graphic that looks like these, this is on the Transit Road image where you see some, page 40, you see some very nondescript graphics. You know, that's not painting that sort of, this is this committee's very clear image of what the town's going to become, right? I'm not saying that those are the most successful graphics in the world. What I'm saying is once you put it into that rendered format and apply the watercolor and say each one of these sites is maximized at this, and to the extent that we're going to show these massive parking decks and all this, it becomes a cumulative sum, right? Well, that committee wants to max out everything everywhere. I've heard blowback. I can tell you I've heard blowback from people who couldn't make the meeting tonight that were residents who have cornered me on the subject. I know that those people are going to be vocal at the town board level. And it would make sense to me that town board would want to push back and say, we don't want to completely blow everything to its maximum height. We don't want to completely blow everything to its maximum value. So what is the actual vision? And if we're going to provide a vision and say this is the vision, then we need to have some economy of scale in the renderings.
Or define this as the vision of a maximum build-up. Because I agree, it seems like density and height are being pushed, are being encouraged, but we don't have to have maximum density and maximum height everywhere.
But we need to make sure that people understand this is a maximum.
So you're thinking that people are going to take this so literally?
They are. They already are. If the challenge of images is the challenge of the way the narrative is going.
Well, that's what you need. That's what you need.
The next phase, that's where we're going to see the nuts and bolts.
Yes.
And you know, Dan's right. I mean, it's to help us have a broader vision, but, you know, I agree with Brian, too. I mean, it is the maximum.
Well, I think that one thing we made clear to Lee tonight, and hopefully he'll respond to it, is east and west of the village, we think that the maximum should be 4 stories. So hopefully he comes back with the rendering that's going to correct the one which shows 5 stories there.
Not in the contract to go back.
Well, but at least explain the fact, okay? So he'll explain it. And hopefully we'll get enough attention for the town board to understand.
Is there an opportunity on 1 or 2 of these to say, okay, here is a minimum option, here's a maximum option, so that you've got 2 visions and you can say this, the rest of them are showing the maximum development of the site. That this at least will give you a chance to try and quiet the naysayers.
I'm not sure, Duncan, that, we might be able to do that. I think one thing I'd point out, I'm not sure this is the maximum development that can occur on those parcels, and I don't know that you are either. That certainly looks dense, it looks very intense. I don't know if it's maximized. We've done that kind of exercise on other parcels in the town. One of the arguments that we made in the office was, what we don't have in this package of things is what the current zoning would allow, which you might find might be much denser than what you have here now. And it doesn't offer anything for anybody to compare to. And we've talked a little bit about that in the office. So, as it stands right now, you know, this was supposed to portray a way to develop these parcels, probably to initiate the kind of conversation we're having right now. And it's a broader conversation that needs to be had outside of this group, obviously. That's the intent, is to have that kind of conversation, to decide where the density and the intensity goes in the town. And when we get to, and I think that's kind of the point where Lee was going earlier, a lot of times in traditional planning, we're going to come up with a plan, comprehensive plan amendment, and then we're going to code to that amendment. That's not what we're doing here. We're flipping that around, so we've got some tangible things for people to look at and say, yeah, I like that or I don't. And this could be here or it shouldn't be here. And that's going to be the kind of the process that we're going to go forward with to try and develop that plan amendment, to try and figure out where the places are in town where density and intensity is appropriate and where it's probably not appropriate. I think we actually started to have a good conversation tonight in that regard, probably more productive than we've had over the last several months. So.
Yeah, but again, to David's point before, he was talking about the large parcel west of the village, okay? That's owned by how many different people at this point? If we ever get to the point where there is one common landlord, okay, so, I mean, you know, we go on and on and on. Okay, it's 9 o'clock. I don't know if anybody's interested in seeing if the Cubs can go back tonight or not, but I have to tandem on one other thing, though, too, not to keep it any longer. I have to agree with Dan. This has been exciting tonight for me, because everybody's participated, everybody's had something to say, and it's really been very beneficial as a whole. I'm sorry, public comment. Yes, we do have to do that before we adjourn. Very possible. Okay, Tom?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to comment on areas. Right, the areas that you're looking at, as far as the commercial activity pilot centers that I mentioned, Worley Drive, and I made
email comments twice, that from Transit Road to the West Village, that this area, it's critical that it be looked at because of there needs to be a reconciliation as far as the $4 million that the town gave to a developer, that the planning board wouldn't give them a permit. So this is an opportunity, and I want to thank Ellen for the comments that she made, that as far as this NYSERDA grant, that it's a part of a major statewide initiative, and that as far as what the mayor, Brian, has done with the Congress of New Urbanism and the Picture Main Street, and as far as the One Region Forward with the University of Buffalo School of Architecture and Planning, that this has to do with what was started in 1969 as far as the relocation of the Williamsville Thruway toll barrier out to the Clarence Travel Plaza as a redesign, as a visitor information center, a part of the I Love New York, the Path Through History. But also having access and egress to the Thruway from Young's Road at the County Community College, as well as to remove the toll barriers on Transit Road and what's now a park and ride, to convert that into a state park and green ride, which will be a multimodal transportation hub that will interconnect. And there are 5 different aspects of this project, as far as the Ellicott Creek, as far as the inland waterway that the mayor has gotten, that we have, as far as the intersection of Main Street and the Ellicott Creek, that's the transportation vortex of northwestern New York State, and that there's history here that goes back like 400 years that people have no knowledge of, and that this project is a part of the Erie Canal National Heritage Area. As far as the, oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Is that 3 minutes?
That was 3 minutes. You got 3 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, any other comments or any other before we adjourn? If not, see you on the 21st, hopefully. Ladies and gentlemen, hello, don't forget we have a joint meeting at 7 o'clock on the 21st, so even if you can't make the town board meeting, the meeting at 7 o'clock.
You need the town board to own it and explain it back to people. not just solicit you and send it to them. That's a problem. So now, what's going to happen, and I agree with you, is that town boards are saying, people are on top of it. Two people that have an extra block are going to railroad this whole thing. Again, I may be getting into the wind on this. What you said, I mean, we're talking about going and explaining to the town board what the committee's vision is. Yeah, I know Ramona's got pneumonia tonight. There are 4 other board members who aren't in this meeting, aren't here, and as we're doing this, somebody at the town board level needs to clearly be able to look and say, here's what we're doing and why we're doing it, and these are renderings that don't exemplify hope or vision for the town, but exemplify 5 moments of study. And my concern is nobody is going to do that, and it's going to sound like somebody's dictating to the town board to do that. Leave a consultant, though. People inherently aren't trusting him. They need one of their elected representatives to own it. And I'm sorry, it's just the way it goes. I'm not. I'll be honest with you. That's why there's somebody on the committee from the board. And she's the one. I'm not saying that, that like me, on Ramona or not. The encouragement of the town board, I had a conversation here last night about the Arlington construction properties, and somebody brought up, they're like, well, the town of Amherst planning comments, or planning comments. We got a comment letter from the town on a review of the Arlington construction. Right? And that just launched into a full-on distrust of the town. So I was able to say, well, we're not going to pay attention to the town comments, and everybody applauded. And I said, well, that's great. Then literally, I got a round of applause for saying we're not going to pay attention to the town comments. And then we moved on to say, okay, as a board, do we understand how we zoned it, why we zoned it, and what we're after? And cool man, everybody on that board can comment on the zoning. Without that graph, we got to build, man. We got to build. She lives in Iowa. I think that's why she's got to do that. I got plenty of work on it, and I know how to do that. Now, I don't know whether they're doing it or not. I think they're saying some rendering out there. It's a rendering, a picture for you. Well, if I put a rendering out there and somebody actually modify my rendering, I need done. I don't think he said he'd answer this. He said he won't. That's what he said. He said we're not modifying it. That's exactly what he said. I'm just saying, to me, that's all fake. Screw it, here's my drawing. You know, as an architect, well, I got to go to a site and tell them that. I think it's part of it. But that's where this is going. I'm telling you, it strikes me that as a member of the committee and I like to be part of this collective group and said, yeah, this guy seems like he knows what he's doing. He's kind of locked in on a vision and sort of, yeah, okay, I'll take your comments. Well, no, I'm telling you, Dan, I've seen it now. 2 meetings, 3 meetings. It's just an unwillingness to modify the vision. Maybe you get too entrenched too far into the graphic. As a consultant, sometimes we're too entrenched in the vision. Okay, vision. I'm not sure that's this is a major statement. I'm not sure that's his statement. I don't think he's planning to have the travel together to help us work through the problem. His exact quote was, if we can get some of our density, he's negotiating for what we're doing with vision. He's not interpreting the vision from the committee, he's giving you a vision and then negotiating against the vision. I'm telling you this is what I think. I agree that I think
area